Imagine living in a world where your daily walk to work could be a gamble with death, a place where the very air you breathed might carry a hidden doom. A time when simply having a baby was the most dangerous thing you could ever do. We are talking about the year 1218. Number 12, the burning threat, fire in a wooden city. Step into a city street in the year 1218. What do you see? Packed houses leaning over narrow lanes, almost touching at the upper stories. What are these buildings made of? Almost entirely wood. Think about that for a moment. Every wall, every roof, every floor, crafted from highly combustible timber, often covered with straw or thatch. Imagine a city constructed almost entirely from giant piles of kindling. This wasn't some isolated village in the countryside. These were bustling urban centers, hives of activity, and unfortunately, ticking time bombs of fire danger. A working woman in 1218 understood this threat at a visceral level, because it wasn't a question of if, but when a major conflagration would sweep through her neighborhood, perhaps even her very home and workplace. The sheer density of buildings, often built without any thought to fire breaks or safe distances, meant that once a blaze took hold, it spread with horrifying speed. A spark from a blacksmith's forge, a carelessly placed candle in a cramped tenement, an unattended hearth in a bakery or brew house, or even a lightning strike on a dry rooftop. Any of these could be the genesis of a catastrophe that would consume blocks, sometimes even entire districts. There was no organized firefighting force in the modern sense. No fire engines, no hydrants, no trained professionals. When the cry of fire rang out, it was a call to the entire community to act. People would rush out with buckets, frantically trying to douse the flames with water drawn from wells or nearby rivers. It was a desperate, often futile effort against an unstoppable inferno. Sometimes the only desperate measure available was to tear down buildings in the path of the fire, creating a fire break in the hope of starving the monster of its fuel. This act of destruction, however, meant sacrificing one's own property or a neighbor's in the desperate hope of saving the rest of the city. For a working woman whose small workshop might be attached to her home, or whose entire livelihood depended on her stock of goods or her tools, a fire meant absolute ruin. Her spinning wheel, her loom, her baking oven, her market stall supplies all gone in a flash. Capital she had painstakingly saved, the materials she had carefully acquired, the roof over her head, the very means of her survival, vanished into ash and smoke. Beyond the immediate loss of property, there was the terrifying personal danger. Imagine trying to escape a burning building with children or elderly relatives navigating smoke-filled, collapsing wooden structures in a panic-stricken crowd. Many did not make it. They were trapped, crushed, or overcome by smoke. Even if one escaped with their life, the aftermath was bleak. Homelessness was an immediate consequence. With her home and workshop destroyed, a woman would find herself on the streets, with no place to go, her livelihood shattered. She might rely on the kindness of neighbors, if their homes had been spared, or seek shelter in a church or public building. Fear of fire was a constant companion in medieval urban life, a silent, ever-present threat that hung over every timber-framed house and every narrow alleyway. Chroniclers of the period often recorded devastating fires that swept through major cities, wiping out huge swathes of the urban landscape and leaving thousands destitute. The rebuilding effort would be monumental, sometimes taking years, and many simply never recovered from such a blow. For a working woman in 1218, the threat of fire was not just an abstract concept. It was a very real, tangible danger that could, in a single terrifying day, erase her entire existence and force her to start from nothing, if she survived at all. The very air of the city, at once vibrant with life, also held the chilling promise of destruction, a promise often tragically fulfilled. Number 11, the cruelty of nature, weather and environmental extremes. It's easy to romanticize a time without cars or towering skyscrapers, but let's be real. Nature in 1218 was a relentless and often unforgiving force. Urban working women, despite living within the city walls, were far from immune to the raw power of the elements. In fact, their reliance on the environment for food, water, and even the functioning of their trades made them incredibly vulnerable. Think about the summer, not just a warm day, but an extended, scorching heatwave. Cities, with their dense buildings and stone surfaces, became unbearable ovens. Imagine trying to bake bread in an already blistering kitchen, or spinning wool in a stifling attic, with no air conditioning, no fans, and often no reliable source of cool, clean water. Extreme heat led to dehydration, exhaustion, and heat stroke. especially for women engaged in physically demanding work or those who spent long hours at market stalls under the direct sun. Records from the period, though not always detailing individual deaths, suggest that heat waves often correlated with increased mortality rates, particularly among the very young and the very old, but also those weakened by labor. Then came the other extreme, winter. Medieval winters were often brutally cold, sometimes lasting for months. Houses, even within the city, were poorly insulated. Fires were a constant danger, as we just explored, but without them, the cold would creep in and kill. Imagine waking up in a freezing tenement, the small, smoky fire barely taking the edge off the bitter air. For a working woman, this meant struggling to perform tasks with numb fingers, battling chilblains, and constantly fighting off respiratory illnesses exacerbated by the cold and damp. The sick and the elderly were especially vulnerable, and many simply froze to death or succumbed to winter sicknesses. The effects of extreme weather went beyond personal discomfort. Prolonged drought could devastate crops in the surrounding countryside, leading to soaring food prices in the city market. For a woman earning a meager wage, this meant that the cost of feeding her family could become insurmountable. What little she earned might barely cover the price of a small loaf of bread, leaving nothing for vegetables, meat, or cheese. This directly led to widespread hunger and malnutrition within the urban population. On the other hand, relentless rain and flooding were also common dangers. Cities near rivers were particularly susceptible. Streets could become impassable mud pits, making it impossible for market women to transport their goods or for laundresses to access water. Floods could inundate homes and workshops, ruining tools, destroying stored goods, and spreading disease through contaminated water. Imagine your small stock of spun thread, painstakingly prepared, becoming waterlogged and mildewed, worthless overnight. Or your oven, essential for your livelihood, being ruined by rising waters. Unpredictable nature of medieval weather, often recorded in monastic annals or local chronicles, highlights a constant struggle for survival against forces that human beings had very little control over. Bad harvest due to too much rain or too little, an unusually harsh winter that froze rivers, or a summer so hot that it made work unbearable, these weren't just inconveniences, they were existential threats. Urban working women, whose lives were already precarious, the whims of nature added another layer of profound insecurity. They lived at the mercy of the seasons, their lives and livelihoods intimately tied to the sometimes merciful, often cruel rhythm of the natural world, a world that could turn against them with devastating speed and without warning. Number 10. The perilous journey, travel and trade risks. While many urban working women in 1218 spent their days within the city walls, many others found their livelihoods inextricably linked to travel, even if only short distances, or to the goods that arrived from afar. Think of the market women who traveled daily or weekly from nearby villages, carrying their produce or poultry to the city's bustling market square. Or imagine the wives of merchants who managed accounts and sometimes even accompanied their husbands on trading expeditions, or who oversaw the family's business dealings when their husbands were away. Even women working within the city, like laundresses, might have to travel to riverbanks or specific wash houses, often carrying heavy loads. For these women, the journey itself was fraught with dangers that most of us today simply cannot comprehend. The roads of 1218 were not paved, well-maintained highways. They were often little more than rutted tracks, turning into quagmires of mud in the rain or choking dust bowls in the dry season. A simple trip could become an arduous slog, made worse by bad weather, broken down carts, or lame animals. Beyond the physical discomfort, there was the ever-present threat of robbery and violence. While cities offered a degree of protection, the roads leading to and from them were far less secure. Bandits and highwaymen lurked in forests and secluded areas, ready to ambush travelers. For a woman carrying money or goods that represented her family's entire livelihood, the risk of encountering such individuals was terrifyingly real. A robbery could mean not just the loss of her earnings, but also physical assault, injury, or worse. Historical records, though scarce on specific women's experiences, frequently mention the dangers of travel and the need for travelers to group together for safety, a clear indicator of the pervasive threat. Even simple accidents on the road posed significant risks. A fall from a cart, a slip on a muddy path, or an encounter with a runaway horse could result in serious injury, broken bones, or lasting disability. In a time with no advanced medical care, a severe injury could mean the end of a woman's ability to work, condemning her and her family to poverty. Moreover, the goods themselves posed risks. Women involved in trade, perhaps buying raw materials like wool or flax from rural areas, or selling finished goods like ale or baked goods in other towns, faced the constant danger of their merchandise being damaged or spoiled during transit. A barrel of ale could spoil in hot weather, a load of fresh produce could rot, or delicate crafts could be broken. Financial loss from such incidents could be devastating, as it represented not just a profit loss, but often the loss of the initial investment, plunging a family into debt. Imagine painstakingly creating a batch of candles or a set of simple garments, only for them to be ruined before they even reach the market. The medieval world was largely reliant on face-to-face transactions and the physical movement of goods, making transportation an indispensable but inherently risky part of many working women's lives. Every successful journey and profitable trade, there were countless perils, each threatening to dismantle the precarious economic balance upon which their very existence depended. A perilous journey was not just a means to an end, it was a gauntlet of dangers, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and livelihood beyond the relative safety of the urban walls. Number 9. The legal labyrinth, lack of rights and courtroom perils. Picture yourself in 1218, an urban working woman. You might have a dispute with a neighbor, a claim against a dishonest merchant, or even find yourself accused of a minor transgression. Where do you turn? The legal system of the medieval era was a complex and often intimidating maze, and for women, it was particularly fraught with peril. While single women and widows generally had more legal rights than married women, who were largely considered legally subsumed under their husband's identity, a concept known as coverture, the playing field was far from level. For any woman, navigating the courts required resources, knowledge, and courage that were often in short supply. Access to justice was not universal. There were no public defenders, no easily accessible legal aid. If a woman needed to pursue a claim or defend herself, she likely had to pay for legal representation or attempt to speak for herself, which was a formidable task in a formal, often patriarchal environment. The language of the courts was often Latin or Norman French, not the everyday language of the common people. Imagine trying to understand complex legal arguments or articulate your defense when the very words spoken by the judge and lawyers are foreign to you. Furthermore, the procedures were often arcane and slow. A simple dispute could drag on for months, even years, consuming valuable time and resources that a working woman simply could not afford to spare. Every day spent in court was a day not spent earning a living, not tending to her children, not managing her household. The financial burden alone could ruin a family. Evidence was often based on sworn oaths, and a woman's testimony might carry less weight than a man's, especially if her reputation had been in any way questioned. The concept of character was paramount, and a woman's perceived morality could significantly impact the outcome of her case. Accusations, even unfounded ones, could stick, leading to a loss of standing in the community and undermining her credibility in court. Beyond civil disputes, women also faced the terrifying prospect of criminal accusations. Theft, assault, or even more serious charges could lead to severe penalties, including public shaming, physical punishment, or even execution. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was far less developed than it is today. Justice could be swift and brutal, especially for those without social standing or powerful connections. Consider the legal vulnerabilities related to debt. If a working woman, perhaps a brewer or a baker, fell into debt, she could face severe consequences. Tools might be seized, her property confiscated, and she could even be imprisoned for non-payment. Without adequate legal protection or easy ways to appeal unfair judgments, women were often at the mercy of powerful individuals or capricious local lords. Historical documents, such as court rolls from various English towns, occasionally reveal the cases of women appearing before justices, demonstrating their efforts to navigate this complex system, but also hinting at the difficulties they faced, especially when they lacked male support or wealth. The legal labyrinth of 1218 was not a place of refuge for the vulnerable. It was a perilous arena where a woman's rights were often fragile, her voice easily unheard, and the consequences of missteps or injustice could be devastating and far-reaching. eroding her very ability to survive and thrive. Number 8, the buyer's deception, adulterated goods and scams. Imagine spending your hard-earned pennies in 1218 for what you believe is a good, wholesome loaf of bread, only to discover later that it's filled with chalk or sawdust. Perhaps you buy a measure of ale that tastes suspiciously watery and flat, or wine that has been dyed to look richer than it is. Urban working women, who often managed the household budget and purchased daily necessities, the risk of encountering adulterated goods and outright scams was a pervasive and frustrating daily reality. There was no widespread consumer protection agency, no Food and Drug Administration ensuring quality and safety. While guilds did exist and often had regulations about the quality of their members' goods, these rules were not always strictly enforced, especially in the chaotic bustle of a medieval market. Unscrupulous merchants and producers were always looking for ways to cut corners and maximize their profits, often at the expense of the unsuspecting customer's health and wallet. Food was a primary target for adulteration. Flour might be mixed with cheaper, indigestible fillers. Bread could be made with inferior grains or even contain pebbles. Meat might be sold past its prime, cleverly disguised with spices or by cutting away the worst parts. Spices themselves, imported from afar and incredibly valuable, were often diluted with cheaper powders. Imagine a woman, already struggling to feed her family on a tight budget, realizing she had been swindled. Not only did she lose her precious money, but her family received little nutritional value from the doctored product. This could lead to illness, malnutrition, and a constant feeling of being cheated and vulnerable. Even non-food items were not safe. Cloth might be sold as pure wool when it was mixed with cheaper threads. Dyes might bleed or goods might fall apart after only a few uses, simply because they were made from inferior materials or through shoddy craftsmanship. For women who themselves were producers, perhaps a brewer, a baker, or a weaver, the existence of such deception also posed a threat to their own honest trade. How could a conscientious woman compete with someone who was knowingly selling an inferior product at a lower price? Maintaining a reputation for quality was crucial, but it was a constant battle against those who prioritized profit over integrity. There were local regulations and occasional inspections by market officials, but these were often sporadic and easily circumvented. Punishment, if caught, might involve public shaming, such as being put in the pillory, but this was not always a strong enough deterrent for those desperate to make a living or greedy for more. The burden of vigilance lay almost entirely on the consumer. A woman had to be shrewd, discerning, and constantly aware of the possibility of being taken advantage of. She learned to inspect goods carefully, to recognize suspicious smells or textures, and to haggle fiercely, but even the most astute shopper could be fooled. This constant need for caution added another layer of stress to the daily lives of urban working women, forcing them to spend mental energy on protecting their meager resources from dishonest sellers, and leaving them feeling perpetually vulnerable to the shadowy practices lurking beneath the bustling surface of medieval commerce. Buyer's deception was not just about losing a few coins. It was about the erosion of trust, the constant struggle for economic survival, and the insidious threat to one's health and well-being. Number 7, the gnawing hunger, poverty, and food insecurity. In 1218, for many urban working women, the most constant and terrifying risk was the gnawing presence of hunger. It wasn't a sudden disaster, like a fire, but a slow, relentless erosion of well-being, a daily struggle to put enough food on the table for themselves and their families. Medieval urban centers attracted people seeking work, but the reality was often a precarious existence. Wages for common laborers and women in service were typically low, often just enough to cover immediate basic needs, with very little left over for savings or emergencies. A woman working as a laundress, a market seller, a spinner, or a domestic servant would work from dawn till dusk, her hands raw, her body aching, only to bring home a pittance that barely stretched to feed her household. This constant economic precarity meant that any slight disruption, a sudden illness, a reduction in work, a bad harvest driving up prices, could plunge a family from mere survival into absolute destitution. Food security was a constant anxiety. The medieval agricultural system was vulnerable to the whims of weather, as we touched upon earlier. Prolonged drought or excessive rain could lead to crop failures, driving up the price of grain, the staple of most people's diets. When the price of a loaf of bread soared, it became a luxury for many. Historical records, like the price records kept by monasteries or civic authorities, show dramatic fluctuations in food costs, indicating periods of severe scarcity. For a working woman, this meant making impossible choices, buying enough bread to fill empty stomachs or saving a few coins for rent, feeding the children, or ensuring she had enough strength to work the next day. Often it meant everyone ate less, becoming weaker, more susceptible to illness. Malnutrition was widespread, making common ailments far more dangerous and contributing to the high mortality rates of the era. The threat of starvation was not abstract, it was a very real possibility. If a woman became a widow, or if her husband fell ill and could no longer work, the responsibility of supporting the entire family often fell solely on her shoulders. Fewer opportunities and lower wages than men, this was an almost insurmountable task. Many women resorted to desperate measures to survive and feed their children, begging, selling off what few possessions they had, or even engaging in prostitution, which carried its own severe risks of violence, disease, and social ostracization. The cycle of poverty was incredibly difficult to break. No safety net, no public assistance, and no easy way to accumulate wealth, a single setback could condemn a family to generations of hardship. Constant, gnawing hunger, the worry about where the next meal would come from, and the chilling prospect of a completely empty larder was a profound psychological burden that overshadowed the daily lives of countless urban working women in 1218, shaping their every decision and casting a long, dark shadow over their hopes for the future. Number 6, the whispers that destroy, reputational ruin. Imagine living in a community where your standing, your very ability to earn a living, depended not just on your skills, but on the purity of your name. In 1218, for an urban working woman, a damaged reputation was not just a social inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Rumors, gossip, and accusations, even if unfounded, could spread like wildfire through the narrow streets and bustling markets of a medieval city, utterly destroying a woman's livelihood and social standing. Public opinion held immense power. There were no anonymous online forums to spread lies, but face-to-face whispers were just as potent, if not more so, in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. A woman's reputation, particularly concerning her chastity, honesty, and piety, was intricately linked to her economic viability. For example, a woman running a successful bakery relied on the trust of her customers. Rumors circulated that she was dishonest, that her weights were short, or that her morals were loose. Customers would simply stop coming. Her business would wither, and she would find herself unable to sell her goods, effectively losing her means of income. The same applied to a laundress, a domestic servant, or a midwife, who would hire someone whose name was tainted by scandal. A reputation for laziness, drunkenness, promiscuity, or even just being argumentative could make a woman unemployable. There were no background checks, no formal employment agencies. Hiring was based on personal recommendations and a person's known character. Once a woman's name was sullied, it was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to clear it. Accusations of theft, witchcraft, or adultery, even if never proven in court, could stick to a woman like mud, leading to ostracization from her community. She might be shunned by neighbors, denied entry to social gatherings, and even refused service by other merchants. This isolation was not just emotionally devastating, it severed the vital social connections that were essential for survival in a world without formal safety nets. Communities often provided informal support systems, sharing food, helping in times of sickness, or offering temporary work. A woman without the support of her community was truly alone and vulnerable. Consider the particular vulnerability to accusations of sexual misconduct. While medieval attitudes towards sex varied, a reputation for being unchaste could be ruinous, particularly for unmarried women or widows. It could lead to a complete loss of status, make it impossible to marry well or at all, and reduce a woman to begging or prostitution, which were often the only paths left when all others were closed. Even married women were not immune. Accusations of infidelity could lead to public humiliation, a loss of dower rights, or even legal repercussions, though these were more likely against men. Pervasive fear of reputational ruin forced many women to live highly circumscribed lives, constantly aware of how their actions might be perceived. They had to be meticulous in their conduct, careful in their associations, and wary of even innocent interactions that could be misinterpreted. The whispers that destroyed were a silent but incredibly potent weapon, capable of stripping an urban working woman of her livelihood, her dignity, and her place in the very society she struggled daily to survive within. This invisible threat was a constant burden, adding to the already immense pressures of medieval urban life. Number 5. The ultimate gamble: childbirth and motherhood. For an urban working woman in 1218, perhaps no daily risk was as profound, as personal, and as terrifyingly inevitable as childbirth. In an era before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before even rudimentary hygiene practices were understood, bringing new life into the world was quite literally a gamble with death, for both mother and child. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. While exact figures are difficult to pinpoint for specific years, historical demographic studies suggest that a significant percentage of women would die in childbirth or from complications related to it. Imagine the fear every time a woman became pregnant, knowing that this joyous event could very well be her last. The entire process took place in the home, often assisted by local midwives who, while experienced, lacked any formal medical training beyond traditional knowledge and folklore. They could do little to prevent infections, manage severe bleeding, or address complications like a difficult breech birth. The labor itself could be excruciatingly long and physically exhausting, pushing a woman's body to its absolute limits. Infection after birth, often from unsterile hands or instruments, was a common killer, leading to puerperal fever or other deadly diseases. Hemorrhage, a major cause of death, was virtually untreatable. Even if the mother survived, the ordeal often left her weakened, making it difficult to return to her demanding work. For a working woman, recovery time was a luxury she often could not afford. Her family depended on her income, so she might be forced back to her labor long before her body had fully healed, exacerbating her vulnerability to further illness. But the gamble extended beyond the mother. Infant mortality rates were also incredibly high. Many babies did not survive their first few days, weeks, or even years. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents were constant threats. Imagine the emotional toll on a mother who had endured the risks of childbirth, only to lose her child shortly after. This was not an uncommon tragedy, it was a heartbreakingly frequent occurrence. For women who managed to survive childbirth and raise a family, motherhood added immense new layers of responsibility and risk to their already challenging lives. They had to balance the demands of their work with the constant needs of their children, often without the aid of modern conveniences like running water, refrigeration, or easy access to childcare. Children were expected to contribute to the household as soon as they were able, but in their early years, they were simply an added burden, however loved. A mother had to feed, clothe, and care for her children while simultaneously earning a living. Illness in the family, especially among children, was a constant concern. A child falling sick meant a mother might have to take time off work, losing precious income, or even face the terrifying prospect of her child's death. Childbirth and the subsequent responsibilities of motherhood were not just personal journeys. They were daily struggles against overwhelming odds, physically and emotionally draining, and a profound reminder of the fragility of life for urban working women in 1218. It was the ultimate gamble, a testament to the enduring power of life amidst the ever-present shadow of death. Number 4. The shadow of the hearth: domestic violence. While the outside world of 1218 presented countless dangers for urban working women, the home, which should have been a sanctuary, often held its own profound risks. For many women, particularly married women, the shadow of domestic violence was a very real and pervasive threat, lurking behind the seemingly peaceful hearth. In medieval society, the husband was largely considered the head of the household, with broad authority over his wife and children. The legal and social structures of the time offered very little protection for women against abuse within the domestic sphere. The concept of marital rights often extended to a husband's right to discipline his wife, which could include physical force. While extreme brutality might be condemned by the community, what constituted extreme was a matter of interpretation, and lesser forms of violence were often tolerated or ignored. There were no domestic violence shelters, no hotlines, no easily accessible divorce laws for the common person. A woman trapped in an abusive marriage often had nowhere to go and no one to turn to for effective help. Leaving a husband meant losing all economic support, potentially becoming a social outcast, and risking further violence or destitution. For a working woman, the impact of domestic violence extended beyond physical injury and emotional trauma. Repeated abuse could leave her with lasting physical disabilities, making it impossible to perform her demanding labor. A broken arm, a bruised eye, or internal injuries could prevent her from spinning, baking, selling in the market, or tending to her domestic duties, thus directly impacting her ability to earn a living and contribute to the household. The stress and fear of violence could also erode her mental and emotional well-being, making it harder to cope with the other myriad challenges of medieval life. Imagine living in constant fear within your own home, knowing that any perceived transgression, any argument, or even a bad mood from your husband could lead to a beating. Historical records, such as court documents, occasionally shed light on instances where women accused their husbands of assault, but these cases were rare, and often, only the most egregious instances of violence that spilled out into the public sphere were ever addressed by the law. The legal system was generally reluctant to interfere in what was considered a private family matter. Furthermore, economic dependence often trapped women in these abusive situations. If a woman's livelihood was tied to her husband's trade, or if she depended on his income for food and shelter, her options for escape were severely limited. She might endure years of abuse out of fear of destitution for herself and her children. The social pressure to maintain the appearance of a functioning family also played a powerful role. Divorce was extremely difficult to obtain, and a separation would bring shame and social stigma, especially for the woman. Neighbors and family members might offer sympathy, but rarely direct intervention that could truly change a woman's circumstances. The shadow of the hearth was a silent, insidious threat, a daily risk that many urban working women in 1218 faced with very little hope of escape or recourse. It was a stark reminder that even within the supposed safety of one's own home, profound dangers could lurk, shaping a woman's life with fear, pain, and a profound sense of helplessness. Number 3, the daily grind's deadly price: workplace accidents. For an urban working woman in 1218, her workplace was rarely a safe, regulated environment. Whether she was a baker, a brewer, a laundress, a weaver, a domestic servant, or a market seller, the daily grind came with a deadly price: the constant risk of workplace accidents. There were no safety regulations, no protective gear, and no compensation for injuries. If you were hurt on the job, your livelihood, and often your family's very survival, was immediately jeopardized. Consider the baker. Her day involved working with heavy sacks of flour, tending to blazing ovens that could reach immense temperatures, and handling sharp tools. A simple slip could mean severe burns from hot coals or boiling liquids, a fall leading to broken bones, or a cut from a knife. These injuries, even minor by today's standards, could become life-threatening in the absence of modern medical care. An infected burn, for example, could lead to gangrene or blood poisoning, potentially resulting in amputation or death. Or think of the laundress. Her work was physically arduous, often performed at a riverbank or public washhouse. She would carry heavy loads of wet clothing, scrub tirelessly, and often work in cold, damp conditions. The risk of slipping on wet stones, falling into the river, or developing chronic ailments like rheumatism from constant exposure to cold water was ever present. A serious fall could mean a broken limb, rendering her unable to work for weeks or months, and likely plunging her and her family into destitution. Women involved in textile production, like spinners or weavers, faced repetitive strain injuries from their constant motions, leading to chronic pain and reduced dexterity. They also risked injuries from their tools: a splinter from a spinning wheel, a jab from a needle, or a more serious entanglement with a loom. Even simpler tasks carried risks. A domestic servant climbing stairs with heavy buckets of water could fall. A market seller could be trampled in a crowded square or injured by a runaway cart. Beyond immediate physical injury, the working conditions themselves posed long-term health risks. Poor ventilation in workshops led to breathing problems from dust, smoke, or fumes from dyes. The lack of sanitation meant that disease could spread rapidly within crowded workplaces. Constant physical exertion, often coupled with poor nutrition, wore down a woman's body over time, making her more susceptible to illness and injury. There was no concept of employer liability. If a woman was injured, she bore the full cost of her medical care and the loss of her income. She might be forced to rely on charity, or her family might face immediate hardship. Many historical accounts, such as coroners' rolls from medieval towns, mention accidental deaths and injuries in various trades, underscoring how common these incidents were. For an urban working woman in 1218, her daily labor was not just a means of survival. It was a constant engagement with physical danger, a silent agreement to put her body on the line, knowing that one wrong step, one unfortunate accident, could be the end of her ability to provide for herself and her loved ones, a truly deadly price of the daily grind. Number 2, the threat on the cobblestones, street crime and violence. Step out onto the bustling, narrow cobblestone streets of a medieval city in 1218, and you are immediately immersed in a chaotic, vibrant, yet undeniably dangerous environment. For an urban working woman, these streets were her workplace, her marketplace, and her connection to the rest of the city, but they also presented a constant, unpredictable threat: street crime and violence. Unlike today, there was no organized, pervasive police force patrolling the streets. Law enforcement was rudimentary, often relying on local watchmen who were poorly paid and often ineffective, especially after dark. This created an environment where opportunistic criminals could thrive, targeting the vulnerable with relative impunity. Imagine a market woman, having spent her day selling her wares, now making her way home with her meager earnings tucked away. She would be a prime target for pickpockets or muggers. The loss of her day's profits could be devastating, meaning her family would go hungry. But the risk was not just financial, it was deeply physical. Robbery often came with violence. A woman might be assaulted, beaten, or seriously injured in the process of being robbed. Such injuries could incapacitate her, preventing her from working and further plunging her family into distress. The narrow, winding alleys, often unlit at night, provided perfect cover for attackers. Even in broad daylight, crowded streets could be dangerous. Brawls could erupt suddenly, involving drunken men or rival groups, and an innocent bystander could easily be caught in the crossfire, sustaining injuries from fists, knives, or even accidental trampling in the ensuing chaos. Sexual assault was another terrifying reality that women faced on the streets. Without strong legal protections or effective means of recourse, women were highly vulnerable. Historical accounts, though often downplaying such crimes or focusing on the legal aftermath rather than the victim's experience, hint at the pervasive nature of this threat. A woman walking alone, especially at night or in less reputable areas, was always at risk. Consequences of such an attack extended far beyond the immediate trauma, often leading to social ostracization and lasting psychological harm in a society that blamed the victim. Beyond deliberate crime, the very nature of the medieval street was dangerous. Runaway horses and carts, falling debris from poorly constructed buildings, or even aggressive animals like stray dogs or pigs could cause serious accidents. Imagine navigating these hazards daily, carrying heavy loads, trying to conduct business, and constantly being vigilant for both human and environmental threats. Public executions and punishments were also common sights, adding a grim reminder of the brutal justice system and the potential consequences of crime, even for minor offenses. These spectacles were often performed in public squares, areas that working women would frequent for their trade. Constant threat of street crime and violence created a pervasive sense of fear and insecurity for urban working women in 1218. Forced them to navigate their daily lives with an acute awareness of their vulnerability, making every journey outside their homes a calculated risk, and transforming the very pathways of the city into a gauntlet of potential dangers, a constant reminder of the unpredictable and often harsh realities of medieval urban existence. Number 1, the silent killer in the air, disease and unsanitary conditions. Of all the risks faced by urban working women in 1218, perhaps the most pervasive, the most insidious, and ultimately the most deadly, was the invisible enemy lurking everywhere: disease fueled by appalling unsanitary conditions. Medieval cities, though bustling centers of life, were also cesspools of filth and pathogens. There was no understanding of germs or how diseases spread. What did this mean for a woman going about her daily work? Imagine the smells: open sewers, overflowing cesspits, animal waste from horses and livestock, decaying food scraps, and human refuse piled in the streets or simply thrown out of windows. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a breeding ground for rats, flies, and countless other disease-carrying vectors. Drinking water was often drawn from contaminated wells or rivers, making waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera rampant. Preparing food in such an environment, even with the best intentions, was a constant gamble with hygiene. For women who worked as brewers, preparing drinks for public consumption, or as bakers handling food for dozens of families, the risk of inadvertently spreading illness was ever present, even if they themselves were meticulously clean. For laundresses, washing clothes in polluted rivers or stagnant ponds meant constant exposure to contaminated water, leading to skin infections and other ailments. Domestic servants, cleaning homes where hygiene was rudimentary, were exposed to filth and disease on a daily basis. Close quarters of urban living also facilitated the rapid spread of airborne diseases. Tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, and influenza were common, and often deadly, scourges. A crowded market stall, a packed workshop, or a cramped tenement apartment became efficient vectors for contagion. When one person fell ill, it was only a matter of time before others in the household or workplace followed. For a working woman, illness was not just a personal affliction, it was an economic catastrophe. There was no sick pay, no public health care system. If she became too ill to work, her income vanished instantly, plunging her family into immediate hardship. Chronic illness could mean the end of her ability to earn a living entirely. The care for the sick also fell primarily on women. A mother, wife, or daughter would nurse the ailing family members, often without any effective treatments beyond prayer, herbal remedies, and rudimentary nursing care. This close contact further exposed them to the disease, creating a vicious cycle of sickness and death within families. The average life expectancy was shockingly low, often in the 30s or 40s, primarily due to the constant assault of infectious diseases. Many children did not survive to adulthood. This pervasive illness and early death created a profound sense of grief and loss, adding a heavy emotional burden to the already difficult lives of urban working women. The silent killer in the air, the water, and the very ground beneath their feet was a constant, inescapable threat. It was a daily battle against an invisible enemy, a battle fought with bare hands and fragile bodies in a world where the very elements of life, food, water, air, carried the chilling potential for sudden death, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of urban existence in 1218.